We have a very, very exciting panel coming up at the moment with a topic that is very dear to my heart, namely the whole question of African agency, or perhaps agencies, as there is so much diversity within Africa about what is done, what can be done, what might be done. And we have 4 speakers. I'm going to introduce each of them very briefly now, so as to save time and stumbling a little bit later on. We first will have speaking Folashade Soule at the University of Oxford, who, I need to turn this over, is a postdoctoral researcher at a very important program at the University of Oxford as part of the Oxford-Princeton Global Leaders Fellowship Program. And Folashade is going to be discussing, from what I understand, negotiating with China in terms of power asymmetry, but also African agency. We'll then be moving on to Zhang Youyi, or in the American way of doing things, Youyi Zhang, who is currently a PhD student in the government department at Cornell University with a dear old friend of mine named Andy Murtha, where he works in development finance issues, but also does very interesting work that compares what the Chinese state and development financing does, comparing both what's being done in Africa and also Southeast Asia. So I'm hoping that some cool questions will be asked in terms of comparisons when we get to the question and answer. We then move on to Zhou Hang, or Hangzhou, who is at the school. I wonder if I know that guy. He's at the School of Oriental and African Studies as a PhD student, working on bringing African bureaucracies back in, particularly the agency of a range of bureaucratic actors in developing capacity in Uganda roads construction sector. And he's a PhD student in the Department of Political and International Studies at SOAS. And then finally, we will have Maddalena, I'm going to hope that I get the pronunciation, Prosopio, yeah, more or less, close enough, who is an associate research fellow in the Africa program at the ISPI, and she has a PhD in IR at the LSC. She will be speaking about Kenyan agency towards the Chinese, the case of the health sector. So we have a wonderful group of people who are all going to be speaking about different kinds of agency and room for agency. But I think that there are also empirically going to be some overlaps with particular issue areas that will come up in later panels, particularly having to do with the health sector. So without further ado, I believe everyone gets 15 minutes. And let's move straight into the most general. Thank
you. So, thank you very much for organizing this conference and for giving me this space and opportunity to present my research on how African governments negotiate with China. So, okay. Well, just, thank you. Since I have the opportunity to introduce this, this panel with the first presentation, I would like just to take 2 minutes to provide some conceptual framework. First, about the asymmetric negotiations. What do I mean by that? The literature on asymmetric negotiation insists that negotiation does not necessarily occur between co-equal parties, and that the resources that are mobilized during the negotiation process are not also the same, in terms of bureaucratic capacities, in terms of skills, in terms of alliances. Those are distributed unequally among competing actors. And finally, the existence of multiple power pools, sometimes within the same country, the same structure, but also outside the government. And so the second conceptual framework that I wanted to introduce is the concept of agency. So, in terms, it's done. Okay. Asymmetric negotiation and agency. So there has been several debates about African agency in China-Africa relation. What does it mean? Well, I think it's important to identify three specific categories. First, the actors, the need to identify the specific actors that are located within the government and how they are exercising this agency. What are their resources, repertoires of action? How do they use it? That's Colin White's theory. And finally, in which context do they use these different repertoires and resources of agency? So I would like to introduce a comparative case study that I led on two countries, two neighboring countries, Benin and Togo. Both, they provide similar criteria in terms of comparison. They are neighboring countries, Francophone, former French colonial rule, but both of them saw China outpacing France in 2004 for Benin and in 2003 for Togo as the main trade partner, as you can see on this graph. Also, in their national development plans, these two countries have mentioned infrastructure, or what they call specifically economic infrastructure, as a priority. So, in China is the #1 financial provider for infrastructure finance development. So since my Togolese case study is ongoing, I have put some screenshots from some of the data I received from the Prime Minister Cabinet, where you can see how they have collected how they have, let's say, put their aid data together. The gray block is how aid for infrastructure development has contributed to the national strategy, again, to reduce poverty. So as you can see, it's a large part, but China is the first bilateral partner in providing that type of finance for infrastructure development, the first one being the West African Development Bank. But the difference between these two case studies is that it's the nature of the regime. So we talked about it a bit in the first panel, but Benin is an established democracy with regular elections being held, whereas in the case of Togo, the former president has been there the current president has been there for several years, and he replaced his father. So Togolese rule of government is closer to an autocracy, and we will see how that has an effect on the negotiation process. So the research questions that I ask myself is, how can you also analyze the exercise of agency against the background of these two systems of government? For this case study, these two case studies, it was about tracing the decisional and negotiation process. So who are the specific actors when we talk about African agency beyond the presidential cabinet? How do they negotiate with China? How do they interact with China? What is their room for maneuver in terms of resources and repertoires of action? And under what condition do they influence the negotiation process? So the methodology is very, very much qualitative. Access to materials, interviews. So access to materials was very interesting because I received most of the contracts from the lower echelon bureaucrats. And I mean, I can give more details about that in the discussion, but having the draft terms of reference and the draft contracts and the final contracts allows or the researcher to trace the evolution and to see what has been negotiated, what has been accepted by both parties, and what has been declined. So semi-structured interviews, and also a bit of quantitative research in terms of data and statistics. So to get into the topic directly, who are the actors and what are the negotiation processes? Well, first, as you can see from the Chinese side, but also from the Beninese and the Togolese side, the similarities are that most of the pledges are made at the multilateral and bilateral level. So multilateral, I mean FOCAC meetings, but also at high-level meetings among these two countries. After that, the representatives from the political side, meaning the embassy of China, would come and meet with the Ministry of Planning in Benin or with the Prime Minister Cabinet in Togo. So Benin does not have a prime minister. It's not in the constitution. And so from the Chinese side, there are both, that's why you can see that there are different types of actors because they are both political, state, and corporate objectives, because there's a representative from the Economic and Trade Mission, but also someone from the state-owned enterprise who comes with a pledge from the policy bank, very often the Exim Bank, asking for what are your strategic priorities, we can provide funding for that. And afterwards, the discussion goes to the sectoral ministries. So on the negotiation table, on one side, you have civil servants with technical expertise from the African side, ministers sometimes that have a technical expertise or are politically appointed. But from the Chinese side, there are both the state and corporate interests, which shows this double logic of the state and the capital, as mentioned by Xin Kuan-li and authors before her. So the profit optimization is very much and more present on the Chinese side. Sometimes also the sectoral ministries are being contacted directly by the Chinese ambassador or by the Chinese trade mission. And in the case of Benin, the Ministry of Planning and Development is circumvented more for speed reasons and also for political reasons. So my argument is that the negotiations are either advantages or disadvantages for African governments depending on three variables. First, the structural asymmetries. The way the bureaucratic capacities within the African government are organized, the way they structure, has an effect on the negotiations. The second variable is the intervention of the political branch, can be very harmful because it's very, very often politicized. And I will show an example on the case of Benin. And finally, the nature of the political regime, whether it's democracy or an autocracy, can facilitate this interplay between state and non-state agency, or can also constrain agency. But that doesn't mean that there's no agency when there's an autocracy. It's just different. So the first case study is a very highly politicized road project that was funded and executed, funded by an Exim Bank concessional loan and the China Geoengineering Company. So it was a turnkey project. Why was it politicized? Because there were lots of, the turnkey project, most of the civil servants were not happy with it because of the different criteria that I mentioned in terms of non-compliance with national regulatory rules. There was no call for tenders, and especially no independent standards control. So how was agency exercised by the different civil servants? Through both benefits and costs stratagems. And I use this graph from an article written by Juliette Carbeau on bureaucratic minorities, how they influence the government negotiations. So coalition building inside and outside the government, the ministry, but also informational maneuvers, the rhetoric that is used, the alliances that are made with the media. These bureaucrats will then denounce these practices on very highly popular TV and radio shows. And the procedural maneuvers consisted in twisting the call for tenders for further projects. For instance, make the presence of an independent standards control compulsory. And in that case, many Chinese bidders would just not be able to comply with that, or had to arrange, their rules to be more in compliance. So it was a semi-success because the wages also were raised. There were several measures, health insurance for the different workers. And so it's this third variable, the democratic regime or nature of Benin, that allowed for this to happen, because there could be alliances between state and non-state agency, and meaning civil society. Very briefly, the second case study that was a major success as well in terms of negotiation, an administrative tower, where, as you can see, most of the agency was exercised in the pre-negotiation phase and during the negotiation phase, because most of the civil servants, before being civil servants, they are civil engineers, architects, so they have this technical expertise and they could negotiate all these technical aspects as well. So this was a major success because they delayed the negotiation just in order to put these clauses. And there was less political intervention as well, because this project was less politicized than the road project. For the president, the road project was important because there were some elections coming up and he had to make that road built. In Togo, and that's the final case study, it's a little bit more difficult. So the CRBC is constructing this road project to bypass Lomé. And there are several issues at stake in terms of workers that are fired. But there are, as you can see, despite the fact that it's not a democracy, currently there are some alliances with civil society organizations, but also in order not to complain against the Chinese, but against the local human resources agency that have hired and provided these contracts with which they're different, with which they are not happy. So here, just the problem, it's less structured. That's the first variable. It's much less structured, and the ministry doesn't have much agency in terms of its civil servants being able to coordinate with these different actors. And finally, just to conclude, one of the question is, there's a lack of, let's say, there's a lack of China strategy for African governments. There are bits of tactics, stratagems, but no coherent China strategy, which is limitative since China is the first trade partner. There's a parallel track for China. The traditional donors harmonize their aid, black rules, and that is not the case for China. Although in the case of Benin, there's currently, it has just been negotiated, this mission where all these different criteria are now as part of an MOU for coherent strategy. So final words, the contribution and implication of this research are that there are some advantageous outcomes that are possible for African governments despite the asymmetry. Variable 2, the executive branch can be an asset. It can be an issue, but an asset also when the executive branch provides negotiation skills to civil servants. Overall, there's a good image of China, as you can see on this graph from the Afrobarometer survey. And so the next steps of this research project is to compare a second set of countries, Cameroon and Ivory Coast, who are larger, and to see whether the strategic resources that they have can be a variable or not. And here again, you have a democracy versus an autocracy. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Professor Brodgam and CARI, to invite me again to the CARI annual conference. And also, without Professor Brodgam and CARI's strong support and recommendation, I would not get a chance to do field research in Kenya and DR Congo. So today, I will, based on my field research and investigation in Kenya and DR Congo, I will discuss African agency in Chinese infrastructure projects from a perspective of the political significance of these projects. So the main research question in this research is, we have seen many Chinese infrastructure projects in Africa, but why on some occasions we see African states successfully align Chinese finance, Chinese loans to their domestic national agenda, but in some occasions they fail. More specifically, I look at how the development of domestic political economy in China shape the environment of African agency. So this is a big picture of Chinese economic role engagement in Africa, and from McKinsey 2017 report, we can see that China has become really a major financier for infrastructure projects in Africa. And the very familiar story about Chinese infrastructure investment, infrastructure projects in Africa is that, so now in China we have very fragmented regulatory stakehood, different line ministries and stakeholders involved, issuing very broad and vague national objectives. So Chinese SOEs, the main implementers of these infrastructure projects, they have a lot of freedom to interpret their own projects as national strategic objectives. In the meantime, the African states has a lot of agency in this process due to the demand selection process of these Chinese aid loan FDI projects, in particular in the infrastructure sector. That's why we see the alliance, natural alliance between African governments, Chinese SOEs, and the Chinese policy banks. The Chinese SOEs helped the African governments to develop this proposal for these projects. African government submitted this proposal to the Chinese government, MOFCOM, and the policy banks, they issue the loans to support China firms going abroad. However, there are some new changes to this very familiar pattern of China-Africa economic cooperation. First of all, in the past 5 years, we have seen a very high level of anti-corruption campaign and also tightened political control in Chinese political economy, which making both Chinese policy banks and also Chinese SOEs more cautious in, especially for Chinese policy banks, they are more cautious in issuing loans. Also, this prolongs their loan approval and makes the whole process more stringent. On the other hand, that due to the surplus of production and energy in China, we see more Chinese SOEs going abroad, seeking for infrastructure projects, in particular in Africa. So that's why we see the tension between less and longer loans and more demands of these infrastructure projects. So in this presentation, I compare Chinese loan to Kenya and Chinese loan to DRC from our own CARI database on Chinese loans to Africa. They represent two different types of Chinese infrastructure loans with different degree of political significance of these projects. So both countries, they have a big infrastructure project financed by China. In DR Congo, is a resource for infrastructure framework under the CECOMINS proposal, and in China, in Kenya, is a railway project mentioned by Wang Yuan in the last panel. So we can see that for the Kenya railway project, because it's a SDR project, because it has been attached strong political significance. That's why we see in 2014, there's when signing the deal, there's a flow of a huge chunk of loans from China Exim Bank. And in the following years, they also were stable finance from China Exim Bank. Last year, during the Belt and Road Summit, President Kenyatta succeeded in seeking financing from China Exim Bank to extend the SGR from Kenya to Uganda. But in the DRC case, it's not a very politically significant case project of the CECO means. It's mostly initiated by a consortium of the Chinese central SOEs. So we see that the Chinese Exim Bank loans, they are more sensitive to the price of the copper. So in 2009, when the contract was signed, there's a huge chunk of Chinese Exim Bank. In the following years, it was almost zero. So in 2015, when the price of copper become higher again, Chinese Exim Bank continued to issue. So it's more sensitive to the price because it's a more kind of commercial-oriented project. So I will not talk too much about the Kenya Railway because Wang Yue has done a great job to present. What I want to say that this is a project significant politically for both Kenya and China. So in domestically speaking, that Kenya have two important domestic projects. One is the SGR, another is the LAPSAT linking Lamu port to South Sudan. And this also, I think, is by far the most important Chinese infrastructure project in East Africa. And that's why Prime Minister Li Keqiang witnessed the signing of this project with President Kenyatta in 2014. So during my field trips to the SGR road construction site, what I've seen that because of the political significance of this project and also because of the stable finance from China Exim Bank, this project ran relatively smoothly despite controversies on, say, data sustainability, environmental social consequence, and also the protest from the oppositions. But we also seen some failed cases in Kenya. Under the LAPSAT framework, less significant to China, the Kenya National Highway Authority proposed a highway linking Kenya to South Sudan to the China Exim Bank, but refused by China Exim Bank because China Exim Bank cared more about the default, the concern of default, and the risks attached to this project, since it's not a political significant project. Then we move to the DRC case. In the DR Congo, under the CECO means framework, China Exim Bank offered $6 billion for this whole package. So half of that going into the infrastructure sector, half of that going to the resource, mainly the copper sector. And this map shows the main infrastructure projects under this framework is mostly attached to the President Kabila's 5 main projects in this country. And also the green dots indicated the resources, the copper. Then, because it's not, this project has not received strong support from the Chinese top leadership and Chinese government sectors, it's most initiated by consortium of Chinese SOEs. So then we see the tension between the DRC government and the Chinese policy bank, here mainly the China Exim Bank, offering these loans. For DRC government, they prioritize the infrastructure. They hope the Chinese firms and the China Exim Bank can offer more loans, speed up the infrastructure cooperation in the roads and also the other infrastructure projects. But for the Chinese firms, especially for the China Policy Bank, they care more about the default and also the risks of this project. That's why they stress that they should put more loans in the resource sector. Unless the resource sector, the resource extraction runs smoothly, they can offer more loans back into the infrastructure sector. So this is the picture on the upper right was taken in 2011 by my colleague, Professor Wang Duanyong, when he first visited DR Congo. This is the CECO means copper site. You can see the pond. There's no copper there, and it's 2011, 3 years after the signing of the contract. And after that, we see the decline of the copper price down to a very low level. That's why China Exim Bank stopped funding the infrastructure in DR Congo in several years. Also here, this picture on the upper right was taken in the Bukavu, the capital of South Kivu province in DR Congo. Because of the delay in resource extraction and because of the decline of the copper price, we also see some delays in infrastructure, the road construction in this specific province. Then later on, we got the chance to have a discussion with the government officials at the South Kivu province. in Bukavu. So in addition to the central government's demand for more and faster infrastructure collaboration, we also see the agency of a local government, the provincial government in DRC. Because of the strong ties between the host government, between the local provincial government and the Chinese firm, here the Sinohydro in the initiation of the infrastructure projects at the ground level. And also the provincial government offered the Chinese firm a lot of support when they conducted the resource activities. That's why the local government also has some leverage to bargain with the Chinese firms and push them to do more road construction, even though the Chinese Exim Bank sometimes did not issue loans on time. So one case we have seen is that when President Kabila once inspected the road construction site in South Kivu province, the governor, the gentleman with the white beard standing in the middle, he demanded and he requested Chinese firms to use their own money rather than the loans from China Exim Bank to conduct more projects, so that he can show that all these infrastructure projects run very smoothly in front of President Kabila. Then the Chinese firms, because they needed further support and cooperation from the provincial government, they paid their own money to do more road and infrastructure in this province without any loans from the Chinese Exim Bank. So this put more risks for their project, since it has been expanding without the guarantee from the Chinese Exim Bank. So several quick takeaways from the comparing the railway project in SGR in Kenya and the Sicomins package in DR Congo. The first one is that the China policy banks have made their loan approval process more stringent, and they are getting more and more cautious and focusing more narrowly on projects with political significance for both African states and for China. Second of all, we should also disaggregate African host states when we discuss about African agency. Especially in the DR Congo case, we can see that in addition to the agency at the central government level, we also see agency at the local government level, which has more interactions with Chinese firms day by day. The last point is that, as I mentioned very earlier, due to this new development in Chinese domestic political economy, we will see that the old traditional type of offering low interest rate loans, whether it's concessional or non-concessional, probably change in the near future, especially for those firms that are non-SOEs who have less connections with the Chinese policy banks. They may think harder about their financing in the future. And also, we will see more endeavors of these non-SOEs or private enterprise in China to try other models of financing like BOT or PPP. So this also may bring some good news for African states to have a diverse set of financing models for their infrastructure sector. So that's it, and looking forward to your comments and suggestions.
Can I start? So hello everyone. First I would like to say thank you to Professor Brottingen for the invitation, as well as Mary Foster for the wonderful logistics. And also one apology for the last minute change of the title of my presentation, but the essence remains the same. And one caveat as well, I'm still doing my fieldwork now in Uganda, so I think it's better to think in an observation way instead of like final conclusions. So it's open to discussion as well. So the title of my presentation is called Everyday Negotiations of Chinese Development Engagement in Uganda, the Case of Road Construction. First, I would like to give you some backgrounds about Chinese presence in the Uganda's road sector. So you can basically categorize three different kind of like categories. One is China as a funder, that is mainly the role played by Exim Bank. Now there's only one project funded by Exim Bank in Uganda, that's the Kampala and Tibet Expressway, the first toll road in Uganda. But still, the Chinese Exim Bank is thinking about funding the oil project road as well in the Lake Albertine region in Uganda. And the second biggest role played by China is the contractors. So nowadays, there are about more than 20 contractors operating in the Uganda road sector. And the third category is about engineers. That means the Chinese companies that play a role of consulting engineers which try to supervise the road constructions. And one observation is that China currently is absent from the donor coordination groups on the transport sector, which is currently led by World Bank and JICA. But China has been, actually JICA has been extended the invitation to China to join this group. But according to my interviews with JICA, they're saying that basically the Chinese embassy is thinking about it, but there's no conclusion so far. And secondly, I want to talk about the dominance of Chinese contractors in the road sectors. According to the document I have access to, that's the URA DRBD. URA is the Uganda National Road Authority. Project status reports January 2018. There are currently 28 projects being supervised by the National Road Authority. These are upgrading projects, which means that you upgrade the road from gravel to asphalt or to DBST. Among these 28 projects, there are 22 goes to the Chinese companies, 3 goes to foreign, and 3 is under procurement. The same situation goes to rehabilitation as well, which try to maintain the road quality. They're about half, so 12 among the 25 projects goes to China. So if I combine this upgrading project as well as rehabilitation projects, you will find that about 12 Chinese companies currently are having a profile, active profile in the Ugandan sectors. For example, CCCC is the China Communication Construction Companies. R7, R3, R5, R18 are the abbreviation for a railway construction company in China. And this is basically the research questions I have currently. It's basically try to ask how do Ugandan public servants supervise the implementation of Chinese construction projects on an everyday basis. As I mentioned before, my focus is mainly on one of the state agency, that's the UNRWA, Uganda National Road Authority. And I try to see how they supervise Chinese contractors. And there are many issues emerging during their daily interaction, which I call in this presentation objects of negotiation. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on the work permits for Chinese expatriates. So some of the background of my research as well. In terms of literature influence, I mainly refer to Stays at Work, led by Olivier de Sacdon, a French anthropologist, as well as Pierre Schenk, a German anthropologist, which basically come up with this concept of gouvernance réelle, which try to argue that we need to go to the field to empirically grounded approach to study what African state institutions actually do on a daily basis. I also refer quite a lot to Heckman and Peglar's work on negotiating statehood, which is a critical state theory, try to also argue that we should get rid of all this neo-patrimonial paradigm to actually study what African states actually do on an everyday basis. In terms of research methods, I mainly nowadays, I'm now doing an internship with URA, so participant observation is the main research methods. I also conduct semi-structured interviews with both Chinese contractors, Western donors, as well as my staff, my colleague. And also I have the chance to assess some of the URA documents, for example, like monthly reports and quarterly reports of each project. Brief detour to the introduction of URA. So basically, it's a state agency created in 2008. It only supervised national roads, so not district roads, not county roads. In 2015, it has a huge restructuring. Basically, because some corruption cases, President Museveni decided to remove the previous executive director and then appoint the lady in blue here in the photo, who is called Katrina Allen, to the ED of URA. She has a very successful career in Uganda. Before she moved to URA, she basically is heading the Uganda Revenue Authority for about 10 years and successfully transformed this institute to a very performing agency. So she has a very good reputation in transforming agency into, relatively speaking, a performing ones. I'm basically now based in this directorate called DRBD, Directorate of Road and Bridge Development. There are basically 5 departments, and more specifically, I'm based in the road development. Basically, it's department that is composed of engineers who is trying to supervising the consulting engineers to supervise Chinese contractors. It's a bit complicated, but that basically, we will see some explanation later. So when I do my fieldwork, I first want to figure out during this daily engagement between Chinese contractors as well as my colleague in Europe, in what kind of occasion they can interact. So I basically find there's 4 categories. The first one is basically formal written communication. It's very formal, basically communication between Chinese contractors and the Euro. The second one is e-platforms, what I call, so basically through emails, phones, means calls, and WhatsApp groups. This is something interesting. Is basically, in my department, all the engineers, they join the same WhatsApp groups. So in case there's something comes up with Chinese projects, they can discuss immediately and then write back or contact the Chinese contractors. And third one is regular meetings. Basically, in each road project, you will observe there's a weekly site meetings and site inspection, as well as monthly site meeting and site inspection, which both engineers from Europe, consulting engineers, as well as contractors will be present. And lastly is the inspections and audits. These are usually carried out by other directorates in Europe for technical reasons, for social environmental issues. Sometimes the executive director as well as the board member of Europe will also visit the projects. Of course, you need to count donors like World Bank, JICA, they will also visit the projects. So there are basically 4 kind of like negotiation tables happening between China and Uganda in the road sectors. And in terms of the issues that coming up from these negotiations, you can also observe 4 different kinds of issues. I've just briefly mentioned them. The first one is land-related, mainly about compensation. That's actually the main reason for delay in Uganda's road sectors for construction roads. And the second one is related to finance, so basically delay payment by the government. And then the third one is social environmental issues. For example, occupational health in terms of whether the workers, Ugandan workers, they're wearing protections, equipments. There's labor issues in terms of salaries, whether the workers have milk on a daily basis, their treatment by the Chinese contractors. And also, lastly, most importantly for my research, or for this presentation as well, is regarding the permits that a Chinese contractor needs to apply for. For example, work permits and other permits I will present you in a later stage. And lastly, is technical issues. So it's like design change, how the roads goes, etc. So here is a brief form of the permits that a Chinese contractor needs to apply for in Ugandan sector. This is a project funded by World Bank. Basically, it involves 7 ministries and agencies, and then Chinese contractor needs to apply for 23 permits in order for this road to be contracted. So you can see, basically, in my opinion, road construction can really be seen as a sign for a state to observe the action of the state and what kind of role the Chinese contractor is playing in. There's something that might be very interesting. For example, Chinese contractor in this project need to write a child protection plan. They need to write about gender action as well for approval. And now I'm moving to the work permit. So here is a form that I calculate 6 projects contracted to the Chinese with different fundings, come from Uganda, DFID, AFDB, World Bank, and as well Exim Bank. And they are in different regions of Uganda. The first 2 projects is in the north, the middle 3 in the west, and the last one in the central region. And you can observe that basically in each project, there's about 10% of Chinese workers present. So relatively speaking, I think it's a quite good performance. For the Ugandan side, they are able to actually hire quite local workers. Okay, there's some technical issues. But basically, first thing I want to discuss here is how the Ugandan staff, my Euro colleague, are able to maintain this kind of performance. The first thing I think they can do is try to reinforce the formal procedures. And what is the formal procedures? Here you will see some formal documents. For example, when the Chinese contractor wants to get a work permit, they need to first write a letter to the consultant engineers. So this one is China Railway 5 writing a letter for work permits approval to the GOV. I believe it's a German consulting engineers. And then the German consulting engineers need to review the documents. And basically in this letter, it says that the Chinese side has not yet submitted the CV as well as the diploma of the applicants. So they asked the Chinese side to redo its application. And in the third letter also comes from the consulting engineers after the Chinese side have submitted diplomas and CVs. They basically argue that these two applicants, they are not working on the project site, but they are working in Kampala. So they are not sure about how efficient, how useful they are for the projects. So they're asking URA to decide. I couldn't find a final decision by URA, but in case they are approved, they are going to write a letter like this to Ministry of Internal Affairs, saying that we recommend this one to the projects, and please thank you for your facilitation, etc. So in this kind of formal procedures, I think that if we discuss agency, one agency that we can really observe for the URA staff is that they try to select the right engineers, and this is not as easy as you would think, because before 2015, there's lots of corruption case because of the collaboration between Chinese contractors and consulting engineers, so that the project doesn't go that well. But with the new era, they really try to select the good engineers to supervise Chinese contractors. For instance, nowadays, all the engineers contracted by the UNRWA, they need to do interviews with my colleague on a one-to-one basis, so that they can ensure that each engineers they hire, they have the capacities as well as professional experience to supervise the Chinese contractors. The second ways I think you can observe agency is relating to intra and inter-institutional cooperation. For cooperation within EURA, my department is cooperating with, for example, Department of Enforcement, of Investigation, of Internal Audit to make sure that the Chinese partners play their roles. Here is a photo of a monthly, I believe it's a monthly side meeting in one of the projects in Western Uganda. So during the meeting, the lady in blue, a bit behind the photo on the behind scene, she's the head of the investigation team. She just come here to investigate other cases, but suddenly during the meeting, she just come up with a question to the Chinese contractor asking that, I would like to review all of your work permits. And then she proceeded and then to review all the Chinese contractors on the site staffed work permits. So here you can see that actually different Euro departments, they try to cooperate to ensure that the Chinese contractors, they have permits. For inter-institutional cooperation, you mainly, in the work permit cases, you will mainly observe the cooperation between URA and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. There's another photo from newspaper, basically is reporting about a joint mission between URA and Ministry of Internal Affairs to investigate China Railway 18, a road project, and then find out that a lot of people, they don't have work permits. Yeah, and then another way that we can serve the agency of my colleague, which I turn here is, which I icon here at the terms of media outreach. I have to, a caveat here is that I haven't been able to do interviews with my colleague in the media relations departments, but this is an argument that comes up with my interviewees from the Chinese contractors. They basically argue that they think Europe nowadays is pursuing a very active media strategy. So every time there's a joint mission, you will see a very active media reports regarding a Chinese company's performance. So that in this case, I think we can argue that basically from the Chinese interviews, they will say that the Euro is cooperating with the media's landscape to put pressure on themselves. Here is a report by New Vision, is the main state sponsor newspaper in Uganda. And lastly, what I turn is about discursive strategy. So basically, I just mentioned about this new ED, Kajina Allen. Basically, she has this reputation among Chinese companies saying that she's very tough and then she's kind of biased against Chinese companies. And then I think my colleague in Europe, they try to use this kind of perception by the Chinese companies. They keep on doing their daily conversations in order to convince Chinese companies to do things that Chinese companies don't want to do, but you should do according to the rules. They all say that the ED is not satisfied with your performance. For example, in one joint mission to investigate whether staff are wearing PPEs, personal protection equipment, the result turned out to be not that satisfactory. And then I have this, I was standing with my colleague for about half an hour, and my colleague kept on emphasizing that in this project, ED is not visiting anymore, and then she's not very satisfied with your performance, in order to convince the Chinese partners to change their behavior. We talk about a lot of things about how the Euro staff can pursue their agency, but there are also some limits. This, again, is not very conclusive at this stage of my research. But first is regarding their individual professional experience and capacities of my colleague. Basically, during the restructuring process in Euro, the new ED basically fired all the staff. So they recruit new staff, which are very young, and then they don't have much experience dealing with the Chinese. And within Euro, if you talk with the Chinese contractors, they always say that Chinese contractor has certain distinguished way of behavior or engagement with the Ugandan sectors. So they need to understand how Chinese contractor behave, and that takes time. And because these engineers, they're very young, so they usually they lack this kind of experience. And secondly is corruption, or what I would call maybe personalization of administrative relationships. Basically, again, I have done interviews with some previously hired by Chinese contractors, translators on the site. In case, for example, if there's audit done by Euro, by the old Euro, I need to emphasize, Chinese contractors usually will pay them in advance in order to know about what this audit is really about, and then how the audit team can go easy with the Chinese. And this is the old, I need to emphasize, this is the old establishment. And for the new Euro, after 2015, I haven't been able to conduct interviews with them on these quite sensitive issues, which I intend to do in later stage. And lastly, is about political interference. This is not really about work permits, but about procurement. So there's one project in Europe, basically, it's a local contractor's performance is very bad. Europe suspended the project, but then the President Museveni write a personal letter to Europe's ED saying that we need to reinstate these local companies, because the local companies which allow more room for mistakes. In internal communication, we see that my colleague, they actually talk about this during the month meeting, and they basically say they are not very satisfied with this decision, but they can only go along with it. They can't do much. Okay, so that's all. Thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to questions as well.
Hello, good morning. I stand between you and lunch, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. Thank you for inviting me, Professor Brotigam. Thank you, Marie, for all the logistics. I'm going to talk about Kenya's engagement with China in health. This is part of my PhD thesis. It's one of the parts of my PhD thesis. I'm going to, before digging into the health sector, I'm going to talk briefly about the analytical framework that I tried to conceptualize in my thesis and why it's important. Okay, well, this is the content outline. No, sorry, hold on. It's at the end. Okay. It's in the analytical framework, there are 2 or 3 important aspects that I want to talk about, which will come up in the discussion about health. First, agency is not about single acts by individuals, but it's a relational process through which the many actors populating a specific arena negotiate interests. I unpack in my thesis, actors, their belief systems, their resources, who initiates the relations with the Chinese, and a number of other things. Why it's important to think about agency like this? It's because within these systems, narrow acts of self-interest are leveraged. It's important to look at different levels simultaneously, so the national, the sectoral, and the issue-specific. A country has many systems of governance, like I show here, health, infrastructure, education, and many more. So it's very difficult to talk of a single Kenyan approach to China. This framework is more valid in a democratic-ish country like Kenya, or might be more valid in it. Finally, identifying these kind of systems and trying to understand them helps understand in turn whether the Chinese comply or act beyond these systems of governance in any specific country. Now, going back, oh gosh, sorry. Okay, sorry, I need to go back. Okay, so talking about specifically health, the health cooperation, there are three issues that represent major types of healthcare cooperation between China and African countries. It's trade in health products and devices, infrastructure for health, and traditional medicine. Due to time constraints, I will focus only on two of them, trade and traditional medicine. They're also the most different in terms of actors, motivations, and modalities of interaction with the Chinese in Kenya. Before digging specifically into these cases, I'll just provide an overview of the linkages between the domestic and international system in healthcare. Apologies about my infographics. I hope they're clear enough. The Ministry of Health is a relatively weak ministry in Kenya. It's heavily reliant on donors, and it's somehow an exception in a country that is overall much less dependent on overseas development assistance than the majority of African countries. Given the volatility of aid provision, the strengthening of domestic capacity has been inconsistent and created a rather fragmented scenario. While in some areas there's been good progress, in others there still remains much to be done. Traditional donors have mainly been involved in specific disease programs like malaria, HIV, reproductive health, etc. The provision of drugs, essential and specifically for those program items, and the provision of infrastructure, mainly projects on the smaller end. In 2007, the Kenya health sector-wide approach was introduced by the government of Kenya to make sure that development partners' objectives were in line with the government agenda and to avoid duplication of efforts. Only major partners adhere to the code of conduct, namely the US, the UK, Denmark, Germany, Japan, the EU, and representatives of multilateral agencies, but China has not adhered. On top of donors, there are various other actors in Kenya, both at the level of policymaking and implementation, which complement the work of the ministry, including a vibrant private sector represented by the Kenya Healthcare Federation and the Catholic Church in particular, and then NGOs, etc. Kenya-China relations in health are part of a broader Chinese engagement with Africa in this sector, but they have particular features. So China's engagement in African countries, mainly in health, mainly revolves around four aspects. First, capacity building, with Chinese medical teams that have been a flagship project for decades. Kenya, however, never requested or received a Chinese medical team. From capacity building since the 2000s, the Chinese moved to commercial activities in Africa, specifically in trade, in pharma and medical products. And in Kenya, they've been hoping to gain a foothold in a market that is relatively advanced, and it's a hub to other East African countries. On top of this, there is infrastructure for health, including malaria centers, and traditional medicine, both research and development, but also commercialization. In Kenya, infrastructure for health, I'm not going to talk about it today, but China built 4 major hospitals and a malaria center. All these 4 aspects are are present in Kenya-China relations, but China's role in the sector is still minimal compared to traditional partners, despite having expanded quite quickly in the past 10 years. The main issues regarding China's entry to the sector concern the fact that China operates outside established institutions in Kenya, outside the systems of governance I was talking about before. China has not adhered to SWAP. Its malaria program is isolated, is not part of the multilateral machine. It did not register with associations of manufacturers and service providers, such as the Kenya Healthcare Federation. Chinese medicines are not WHO pre-qualified, which is necessary for public bids, except for 2 in the malaria domain, and I'll talk about them. This might change in the future, as China is interested in becoming a more relevant actor in global health, but it's not the case so far. For Kenya, then, the arrival of China's men learning to match domestic needs, widely fulfilled by long-present development partners and commercial actors, with the Chinese peculiar offer of development assistance and trade. So in terms of trade, there's a complex scenario. So the main goal for healthcare in Kenya Vision 2030, which is the country's development blueprint, is that to provide equitable and affordable healthcare at the highest affordable standard to all citizens. Chinese products are considered key to achieving Vision 2030's goals, thanks to their extremely affordable price and good quality. This also resonates with China's pledges to change the historical lack of medicines in Africa, focusing in particular on malaria, HIV/AIDS, cholera, tuberculosis, and a few others, as well as providing equipment such as mosquito nets, etc. But this willingness at the macro level, both for Kenya and China, actually clashes with the lower level contexts, which are highly populated by local and international actors. There are a couple of specificities to this sector. First, there's a difference in China's penetration rate in the sector between public and private, so pharmaceuticals, devices, etc. And there's a difference between China's penetration in the pharmaceutical side and medical products. So in terms of pharmaceuticals, Kenya is the largest producer of pharmaceutical products in the Comesa region. It produces 30% of all the medicines it needs. The rest is produced in India, the EU, US, and China. India is the historical provider and competitor of Kenyan drugs. It's low prices that have been the main incentives for this long-lasting relationship. Indian companies produce in India, mainly because active pharma ingredients are available there, but there are various Kenyan Indian companies producing also in Kenya. Other European and US companies also, some produce in Kenya. Chinese companies do not produce in Kenya, only produce in China. Medicines are divided into essential drugs, so those needed by hospitals and for daily life, and program items. In terms of essential drugs, Kenya is the provider of, has the largest share of generics, whereas the US and EU have provide branded items. For program items, instead, mainly generics come from India, branded again from the EU and the US. The Chinese provide some of the essential generics that I mentioned. They don't provide program items because their medicines are not WHO pre-qualified, except for 2 malaria medicines, Cotexin and artesunate, which have been WHO pre-qualified. In terms of medical products and devices, the situation is a bit different. China has become the largest provider at since 2011-2012. It provides mainly equipment to second and third tier clinics, private clinics in Kenya. Chinese products are considered cheap and good quality, and they're quite spread out throughout the country. Whereas all the other equipment is mainly provided by India and then the EU and the US. So there are mixed results when it comes to matching the Kenyan system and the Chinese arrival. The Chinese are entering very limitedly the pharma sector, while more the medical products one. The Kenyan rationale is with no WHO pre-qualified drugs, no public bids. Cheap medical products are within standards, then yes, you can enter the market. So Kenyan actors decide and choose to follow preset routes of multilateral cooperation rather than negotiating with China independently. For the private sector, it's a bit different. The Chinese are entering through agents, not directly, except for one company. But yeah, they're not entering directly because the cost of getting into the sector are too high. Agency in this case resides in the recognition by Kenyans that the existing system of governance works and there is no need to change it. It is about bringing China into this framework, and it shows that when governance is particularly rooted and defined and it works, then Kenyans opt for sticking to it, not to change it. Very different case is that of traditional medicine. While in the case of trade, the Chinese are pushing to enter a sector highly populated by local and international actors. In the case of traditional medicine, the Chinese are invited to enter the sector due to their expertise in traditional medicine. While the system of governance for trade was mostly considered suitable by Kenyans to safeguard their domestic interests, in the case of traditional medicine, the system is considered unsuitable. There are no protections for practitioners. There's no protection of the product itself, traditional medicine, and these left significant gaps for foreign traditional medicine products and practitioners to enter the country, angering locals and creating a number of problems. So for Kenyans, for a number of actors, it became crucial to improve and change the system. Here is a short timeline of why the system is complicated and how it changed. Just very briefly, in 1926, the British colonizers imposed on the country the Witchcraft Act, which basically prohibited the use and the exercise of traditional medicine. Over the years, it became these regulations became looser. Yeah, and up until the 2010, when the Constitution included a clause on preserving and protecting indigenous knowledge, and then in 2014 with the creation of the traditional Traditional Health Practitioners Bill. What happened here was that a number of actors pulled together to create this natural products industry initiative, different actors at different levels of society. Ministerial level, the national museums, the Kenya Medical Research Institute and NATHEPA, which is a local traditional practitioners association. They came together and the idea was to entirely restructure the system at the policy level, at the legislative level, to protect practitioners and to protect Kenyan traditional medicine. This was why the reason this was the case was that, as I mentioned, a lot of foreign practitioners and foreign products could enter the country, and they were somehow, they had an easier life in being produced and practiced than Kenyan ones. The Chinese were considered a competitor by Kenyans for partly because their traditional medicine entered the sector, but it is much more advanced than the Kenyan ones. Its packaged and it's studied. Ingredients are well defined, whereas in the case of Kenya, they're not. So it's not really a competitor. Partly, it's also considered a system to learn from. So capacity building was associated to these. It was important for Kenyans not only in terms of medical training, but also in terms of management training. So including the syncing of conventional traditional medicine usage in the national healthcare system. And partly, China was considered a partner for research and development. A collaboration on this did start with the aim to work on an HIV drug to be distributed in Kenya, but the Chinese focused on developing a Chinese traditional medicine, and Kenyans pulled back because they wanted to develop their own traditional medicine. To conclude, very quickly, as I mentioned earlier, agency towards the Chinese is a relational process between state and social forces. Yes, big men exist. Yes, social forces exist. But their existence and their relations are based upon a broader frameworks of social-political and economic governance. Acknowledging that these spaces exist, domestic spaces exist, is quite important in Sino-African studies. When for a long time it was believed almost that Sino-African relations were happening in a vacuum. Political, economic, ideological, etc. Agents are not only passive, they are also very proactive, as the case of traditional medicine shows, and many others. And last but not least, China is still new, and this newness is a variable influencing perceptions, ideas, and potentially outcomes. And Kenyan agents keep learning and relearning how to engage with the Chinese in different rounds of negotiations. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to say that we are exactly on time. We have a huge amount of wonderful, glorious empirical detail to consider here, which is always great fun. And so let us open the floor. Sorry. 3 questions at a time. 1, 2, let's get someone over here. 3, okay. Please identify yourself and.
Thank you. My name is Jijiang Huang. I'm the Senior Research Assistant at China ACRA Research Initiative. I have a question for Youyi, and you mentioned it's very interesting that the Chinese SOEs were more eager to enter the projects than the Chinese policy banks were, due to concerns of repayment. And that's very interesting because usually you imagine policy banks are more able to actually digest the risk than the contractor themselves do. So under what circumstances are contractors more eager to enter than policy banks? And when is it that policy banks actually have to drag the contractors into a particular project that they don't want to do?
Thank you. Cinnamon Dornseif. I'm with the International Development Program here at SAIS. And I think this theme came up in virtually all of your presentations. And you talk about sort of a parallel track for Chinese assistance. And you talk about possibly, Madalena, you mentioned that there is a possibility that this may change. So I would ask all of you, what do you think would be key factors to encourage China to become more a part of traditional norms and not so much on a parallel track?
Hi, I'm Barney Walsh from the African Leadership Centre. I had a question for Hang Zhu about Uganda. I wanted to know, have you come across the role of local fronts in your work? Because I know in Uganda, to get contracts signed, big contracts, the company has to go through a local front. That might be a powerful minister or a particular businessman, etc. And they, of course, get some kind of benefit or some kind of kickback or whatever. And I didn't know if you could speak to that in the road sector.
Who's first?
Well, I mean, just on this parallel track, in the case of Benin, Togo, and maybe Kenya, the issue is that the traditional donors are mostly DAC members, so they follow DAC rules. China is not and doesn't want, at least so far, to become a DAC member. Although there are some, let's say, socialization processes, training programs, there's a DAC in China working group. In the case of Benin, for instance, what the government has been doing is to keep this parallel track, but to make China comply to international norms. So in terms of the quality of the materials, environmental norms, but these things take time. It has taken 2 years to get this, and it's still a MOU, so it's not it's on the fixed norm yet. So it's a work in progress, but it comes from the African governments themselves.
Yeah. Just to add, there are different areas. So in terms of traditional medicine, I think China is not really trying to be part of traditional norms. It's actually trying to push the WHO to increasingly recognize traditional medicine at the global level. In terms of pharmaceuticals, the Chinese pharmaceutical sector is still quite new, is still quite young, so it's just a matter of time. It will get to, the Chinese medicines will get to be WHO qualified. And in terms of, in general, at the global level, I think the Ebola crisis was a turning point for China's involvement in global health. It recognized the importance of global health, and it played a significant role. So it's not ignored by other players, and it's getting into these broader systems more significantly. Yeah.
Thanks for Jaejeon's question. According to my engagement with Exim Bank staff members and officials in the past several years, I think due to the domestic political economy I mentioned in the presentation, the anti-corruption campaign and also the tightened political control, they are getting more and more nervous about bad debt, and also nervous about their responsibility for these recipient countries. So that's why we see in the case of DRC is that the Chinese bank stopped for several years to issue. Actually, it's a loan agreement agreed by both sides before, but they still stopped issuing more loans in a several years when the copper price was very low, and they were concerned that the DRC government cannot pay back in time. In the meantime, for the SOEs, especially for the contractors, they do not need to worry too much about the financing problem. Their main job is to get the work done, and also if they can get more projects, this also is better for them, for their performance and also for the promotion of their SOE leaders. So that's why the Chinese contractors are less concerned about the financing risks than the China Exim Bank and the policy banks.
Okay, thanks for Bali's questions. So you probably get the impression that during my presentation, much of my research has been focused on the implementation side of China's construction projects. I think I basically choose an easier way for my PhD life, because what you asked for is mainly about the procurement, which is a very sensitive issue in a state like Uganda. So I might have some, so I don't really have an answer to your question, but I might have some insights. I think some perspective on this. First, I think some of the Chinese, or even you can call Ugandan Chinese, who has been established in Uganda for years, I think some of them have been involved in these local intermediaries in order to facilitate Chinese contractors to get the contract. That is something I think is happening in Uganda. And then that's basically what I have observed so far on that local intermediaries issues. Another perspective I can share is about the huge or the long process of administrative review during the procurement process. So if everything goes by law in Uganda, every road is open bidding, and then you submit, apart from Exim Bank financer, and then you go for bidders, and then, but in cases, in Uganda cases, lots of roads, they have like huge, long process of administrative review. I think for my interviews with Ugandan colleagues, they mainly believe that it's the Chinese competitors. They try to being whistleblowers in case other Chinese companies, they win the contracts. So this probably prolonged the process a lot. But these are basically the few points I can observe during the field work. I don't really have a direct answer to your question, though.
Okay, next round. One, before we get, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Thank you. So Laura from the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department. I have sort of a two-part question. So the first may be better for the first two speakers about financing terms. So beyond just not having the Chinese members of the DEC, they're not part of the OECD Export Bank group. And so I'm wondering, as you're looking at the contracts, if you have actually looked at the financing terms and can speak to those. And sort of in parallel, the IMF has approached China and they've agreed to join with the IMF capacity building effort to help them better deal with debt sustainability in Africa as they push out OBOR. So if you can speak to that, it would be very much appreciated. And then in Uganda and DRC, again, because international norms, which are predicated on environmental and social issues, because of this parallel track we talk about. In Uganda, I don't know, you must be aware, there was a huge World Bank inspection panel case in the road sector where there were multiple rapes of young girls and gender-based violence, and we're seeing a similar situation in the DRC in the road sector with some of the contractors. And so could you talk to what you've seen in terms of the new Ugandan Roads Authority and its ability to handle some of those risks? Thank you.
Who is, there was someone, yeah. Yeah.
My question is to Mr. Zhang regarding your comment about the Bukavu regional government's ability to form connections and get roads built by Chinese SOEs. On the flip side, can local governments, in your experience, act as effective veto parties against initiatives that are being pushed by the central government? And if so, in which cases is such veto action effective?
And then.
Rich Deidu from Coastal Carolina. I want to ask Jan, I know the LabSet project was a signature project by Mwai Kibaki to connect the marginalized communities in the north. And so with such disinterest in developing that project by the Chinese, did you see any or sense any pushback or an attempt to lobby these companies to try as much as possible to execute this project, since it was needed to just connect these marginalized northern communities in Kenya?
So, very briefly on the financing terms in the contracts. Well, I'd say that in the case of Benin and Togo, the contracts that I've been able to have access to, it's quite clear. First, those are concessional loans or zero interest loans, I mean less than 2% or less. The concessional loans, yeah, 2% or less, and zero interest loans as well. Very often, it comes with a package, at least in these two countries, where when the company engages with the sectoral ministries, they already have a pledge from the Exim Bank. So that's why it's, let's say, it's quite fast to move on the project. So far, in terms of the reimbursement, in the case of Togo, the China, I think, aviation group has built rehabilitated two of the main airports in Lomé and in the north, and the reimbursement process has been through the setup of an airport tax. And this company had already done the same in Senegal, but also in Greece. So I think they are using some best practices, if I can put it that way, and try to apply them in other case studies as well.
Very briefly on the financing terms, I think, as you mentioned just now, there's concessional loans and preferential export credits at 2%. Also, there's non-concessional loans offered by China Exim Bank and the CDB at a relatively higher, say 3%, 4%, 5%, still lower than commercial rates. And increasingly, we see that the Chinese policy banks offer a mix of concessional and non-concessional loans, and also sometimes they demand the firm to have up to 15% of their own money at capital in the project. For example, in the South Ring of the Nairobi project, the Chinese bank only offered 85% of the loans and of the financing, and they demand the firm to. So it's getting more and more complicated and mixed, and we need to discuss case by case. And also very briefly about the Bukavu case, and I think there are two factors, from my point of view, that determine whether the local provincial level government act as either enabler or a kind of a veto power in these infrastructure projects. The first factor is the political affiliation. So in the case I talk about Bukavu, the gentleman, the governor of Bukavu, of the South Kivu province, he was a political ally of President Kabila. That's why he strongly kind of promote. But in the Kenya case, in the SGR case, the local governor of Mombasa, he was from the opposition party, so that's why he tried to block, although he failed the SGR project. The second factor is the capability, competence. So this gentleman from Bukavu, he was very competent to implement this project and demand the Chinese firms to take more risks to conduct more infrastructure. But in most of the local governments in DR Congo, they lack this capacity and the competence to interact with the foreign actors. So I think these two factors matter. And also very quickly for the LabSat program, I think you are right, it's a very important project for Kenya to include the marginalized communities in northern part of this country, and also it's critical for them to connect with South Sudan and other inland countries. The issue that I think from the China side, they put more emphasis on Mombasa port than the Lamu port. So that's why they put more political significance to the SGR project linking Mombasa to all the way to Uganda, rather than the LabSat project. And that's why. So I think that's their consideration about the LabSat program. Thanks.
Yeah. So regarding the question on Uganda, so yes, I'm aware of this World Bank actually suspension of funds to Uganda for about 2 years. There are a couple of points I want to make here. I think after suspension, basically UNRWA, as the national agency in charge of road construction, they did pay a lot of attention to the gender issues, or in general, social environmental issues now. First, I want to make is like the high-level kind of commitment from the ED. From what I've known, she actually fly personally to DC to engage with the World Bank on the resume of the funding and make a lot of commitment regarding improvement on social environmental issues. The second things I know is that there's actually a MOU signed by UNRWA and Ministry of Gender in Uganda, try to make the division of labor in terms of supervision of road construction projects on gender-related issues more clearer. The third thing I want to mention about, for example, when I attend the monthly meeting on the only World Bank project nowadays funded by, in Uganda, in the Kaboya, Chinjojo projects, we have about 7 hours monthly meeting. To be frank, the technical issues only covered in maybe 5 minutes. The rest 6 hours and 55 minutes is all about social and environmental issues, from contracts, from whether workers have milk, from salaries, etc. And if you talk with the Chinese contractor, they feel very frustrated. They don't think that this should be the priority. While for Euro staff, it's another thing. I talk with other engineers as well. They feel there's a lack of expertise themselves as well as an engineer's background to understand actually how to tackle gender issue as well. This is one of the things they feel quite frustrated. And then, of course, they're going to resort to help from the Department of Environmental and Social Safeguard Department in Europe. This another new development within this department is that actually before 2015, there are only 2 staff within the whole Europe in charge of social and environmental issues. But now, because of World Bank suspension, as well as other help from DFID mainly, they're actually able to expand to about 15 people. So there's also improvement in terms of capacity as well.
Okay, I think we have time for one more round. So 1, 2, 3.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Henry Tugendhat. I'm a PhD student of Professor Brautigams here at SAIS. My question is for Dr. Soule. Thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. I was really interested in one of your arguments about bureaucratic capacities affect outcomes. I was wondering how you measured bureaucratic capacities between the two countries that you were focused on, whether what kind of differences there were between the two, and also whether it's as simple as saying smaller bureaucracies find it more difficult to negotiate with China than, say, a bigger bureaucracy like Nigeria's that will have more lawyers to negotiate contracts and so forth, or if the argument is more nuanced than that. Thank you.
I'm Ram from a visiting scholar from SAS. I have a question for Yu Yi. So actually, you just talk about the anti-corruption campaign in China and the financial decision of some policy banks. They tend to be more and more cautious. So it seems that you are suggesting there is a kind of causality between this campaign, which is actually a kind of, I think it's a domestic issue with regard to, they become more and more cautious. So even if the policy banks made some bad decisions, it's a matter of competence rather than this kind of wrongdoing or corruption. So what are your logic for such kind of the two things? Yeah.
Okay, and then yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I just wonder, first of all, maybe combination with this panel with previous one. How do you select a project to evaluate the need of African country or the region for this type of study? Whether you are really based on the human needs or the China want to sort of help Africa to solve the human needs. And I was aware the previous study and people complain there's not even water. So I just wonder, especially on health field, why there's no project on the water and the project that really solve the people's general public's well-being rather than based on the negotiation between the government officials and the financial institution to set up a project. And even the project is finished, I'm not talking about unfinished, even the project is finished, it's not necessarily means improve the well-being. Okay. So I just wonder if you can really, based on this priority of human needs, to say how are we going to accomplish the job, and especially China now is the anti-corruption policies, and do they follow the money to see whether it's really resolve the problem of the social needs?
Good.
Thank you. So briefly on the first explanatory variable on bureaucratic capacities. So it's both bureaucratic capacities, but also internal coordination. So in terms of the capacities, the first issue is very often that, so these civil servants, especially when the negotiation comes down to the sectoral ministries, these civil servants are technical experts. They do not necessarily have negotiation skills or negotiation training. And there is where the problem lies, because on the other side of the negotiation table, you have corporate interests and business representatives who are very, or are said to be very aggressive in terms of how to negotiate. So these, let's say that one of the, between Togo and Benin, I think the fact, and that's where the third variable comes, is the fact that Togo is not a democratic country. The civil servants there have different strategies in terms of addressing these imbalances. So they are maybe less assertive, but they have these obstruction strategies. And what they will do then is make some alliances within, the ministry to get for instance, what the foreign minister said of Togo last year. He said that China should provide more technology transfer. And one internal idea now is that if they don't succeed in negotiating that, they would go to South Korea. Because South Korea, at least proposes a fuller package of knowledge transfer, infrastructure development, and technology transfer. The second question on whether there's a difference between smaller and larger bureaucracies in terms of these capacities, I don't think so. I think, and there comes the second variable of political interference. There's now a new president in Benin. He has been there for 2 years. He comes from the private sector, and one of the decisions he took is to provide negotiation capacities to some of these bureaucrats, especially the higher level ones. And this also comes with providing expertise. There are now international law firms with Chinese lawyers coming in the negotiations, Chinese lawyers who have expertise and knowledge of how Chinese policy banks work. So that can also be an asset. So political interference can be both either harmful or can provide, positive inputs. So, yes, thanks.
Oui.
Thanks for the question. I think the ongoing anti-corruption campaign in China is very comprehensive. So it's not only about anti-corruption. Anti-corruption is also about the tightened political control, and also about the more kind of difficult process to get these projects done. And we know that in the past several years we have seen examples from Chinese SOEs, from Chinese policy banks that have been targets for these anti-corruption campaigns. So the result is that they prefer to prolong the process rather than getting them done quicker. So that's why in the past several years we see more contracts, but we see less contracts have been realized. So I think the comprehensive impact of the anti-corruption campaign has really a very strong effect on Chinese outbound capital flow.
So I think that human social needs need to match commercial or development needs. So development actors have their own agendas and priorities, and so do national governments. As I mentioned, traditional donors, when they provided aid to Kenya, and they still do, obviously, they focus on their agendas, which sometimes are part of broader global agendas of development. For example, here I talked about health, but the case of education is similar. For maybe a decade, the focus was on education for all, and the secondary education and technical education and training were left behind. So now you have a country, for example, in Kenya, where you have a lot of children that have primary education, but there's not much more beyond that, which is lacking. So that's why in Kenya, for example, in the case of health, they created the SWAP sector-wide approach in 2007 to align national and the national agenda with the traditional donors agenda. But conception and implementation are two different processes. And yeah.
I think we have time for one final very quick question.
Haley.
Haley. Haley? Okay.
I wanted to return to the question of parallel tracks, and so it's my impression that most traditional donors would like to integrate China into these sector working groups or anything with coordination groups with the DAC. But I'm wondering, from your experience in the sectors and the countries where you've worked, to what degree do African governments at a national or at a local level actually want that integration? And here I'm curious if that parallel track offers some strategic benefits for governments, for African governments or African local agencies to keep those tracks separate, and whether there's strategic value in their negotiations to just divide and conquer, so to say.
Maybe I can. So, very brief answer. I think it depends on the country. So, for example, like relatively good country like Kenya, I think they welcome the coordination between, say, traditional donor and Chinese donors, because both parts they have projects in this country, maybe in different sectors, and Kenya can benefit from both sides. But for a country like DR Congo that has been in conflict for so many decades and also has faced a very hard time, we see relatively little engagement from traditional donors and in this country compared to the very large size CICOMINS package. So under that situation, this country, they have no choice just to rely more on the China side and then negotiate more on the China side. So I think that's a brief answer.
It's also more sector specific, I would say. In the case of Benin and Togo, there's no sectoral group on infrastructure from the DAC side because, as you know, the MDGs in 2005 have put governance and social issues at the forefront of aid development. So these traditional donors have pulled out of the infrastructure sector. So it's in the benefit for these countries sometimes also to have China in this track of providing infrastructure and being one of the key donors in that, or at least providers of development cooperation in that sector.
Yeah, briefly. I agree, it depends on sectors, it depends on how the country is organized. In Kenya, for example, with the malaria center, which is provided by China, it's not part of the multilateral system, and it's sided, basically. Not because they don't want help from the Chinese, it's just that there's no purpose, there's no value in negotiating bilaterally with the Chinese in a system that is well organized multilaterally. In other areas, they do welcome bilateral negotiations, so it really depends.
Okay, terrific. We have much to think about and continue to reflect on. Please join me in giving a hand to these wonderful researchers and their wonderful work.